You may have seen the movie Gladiator. The main character in this film is a gladiator who has been enslaved, yet is portrayed as a fierce warrior. In the movie, we see that the life of this slave is harsh and miserable. However, if we compare it to the lives of other slaves from the same era, our gladiator appears to be quite fortunate. Now let's take a closer look to see what life was really like for a slave in ancient Rome. The slaves we are familiar with from the 18th century in America primarily worked in cotton fields or engaged in other agricultural or manual labor. However, in ancient Rome, a slave did not have a specific job. They had to do whatever task was required of them, whether it was farming, cleaning, transporting goods, working in mines, or any other grueling job. These slaves didn't have a permanent place to live either. It wasn't clear where a slave might be sent from one day to the next. And of course, their transfers weren't as convenient as boarding an intercity bus and being told, "Go work in such and such city." Instead, they would be loaded with a heavy burden for the journey they were to undertake. They were not allowed to travel empty-handed. They had to carry at least some load with them to their destination. So, who were these slaves? They weren't a special kind of people. Anyone could become a slave. A person could be wealthy and live an ordinary life one day, only to become a slave the next. For instance, someone might get into a conflict with someone more powerful, lose all their wealth, and even be enslaved themselves. Other slaves came from prisoners of war who could be captured from across the vast Roman Empire. Some regions would rebel against Rome, and when they were defeated, the captured rebels would be enslaved as punishment. In ancient Rome, a debtor who couldn't repay their debts on time was also required to become a slave to their creditor. There were no extensions or leniency, no "I'll pay tomorrow" or "next week." The debtor had to work as a slave for their creditor for a duration proportional to the debt, after which they would regain their freedom. For example, a Roman might want to buy a piece of land but lacked the money. They would negotiate with the landowner and ask, "How many years of servitude do you want in exchange for this land?" The landowner might reply, 3 years. The buyer would then begin working as a slave for the agreed-upon period, doing whatever the master commanded until they fulfilled their obligation. After 3 years, he would be freed and the land would belong to him. Now we're using 3 years as an example. A slave should not be confused with a worker or an employee. These people worked long hours and did hard labor. They had no time off, and if they made even the smallest sound of complaint, they were punished with lashes that would hit their heads and faces. Sometimes, they were even beaten deliberately. This is why they dared not make a sound. Essentially, a slave had an owner and no freedom of choice. Woe to the slaves whose masters didn't like them. If the master didn't like them, he had the authority to easily kill the slave and even crucify them to serve as an example for other slaves. Now, what kind of food did these slaves get? They were given just 2 things. One was a little bit of wheat so that they could go and make their own bread, and the other was wine. They were not given water, because in ancient times, clean water was more valuable than wine. This was because flowing and running water was more polluted back then, so clean water was hard to come by. People who knew that river water would make them sick preferred to drink wine so that they wouldn't die. For example, slaves working in fruit orchards could secretly eat a piece of fruit, but they were playing with their lives. If their master or any of his servants saw them, they would be severely punished. You know that since 300 BC, the ancient Romans had war slaves, the ones we call gladiators. These slaves were captured in wars, and the good warriors among them became gladiators, coming to fight in combat shows for the wealthy and nobles of Rome. It didn't matter if they were killed in the process. Now, where did regular slaves sleep? Each slave slept wherever they worked. For example, if they worked on a farm, there was a place like a prison where they were thrown in at night so they wouldn't escape, and they could sit there to rest. However, slaves who worked in houses were in the safest position, and they were allowed to sleep in a corner of the master's house. One of the characteristics of slaves was their clothing, because they didn't have any clothes. They were given 2 pieces of white cloth and told to wrap them around themselves, both men and women, in both winter and summer. In winter, they didn't have anything warm. Interestingly, some senators in the Roman Senate felt pity for ordinary people and said that we should define the population of Roman slaves, but their proposals were never accepted because all the other senators were slave owners and didn't want the huge number of slaves to be revealed, which would lead to them losing their slaves. You should know that 80% of the population of Rome were ordinary people. Ordinary people did not own slaves because owning slaves was costly and they couldn't afford it. Only the top 20% were slave owners, and they didn't allow ordinary people to know how many slaves there were because they feared that if people found out, it could lead to a revolution. In 71 BC, such a situation arose and a revolution broke out. Spartacus mobilized tens of thousands of slaves to revolt against the Roman government. Spartacus, as you know, has been portrayed in films, and in the films, it shows that he ultimately fails, and a Roman general named Crassus defeats the slaves and kills Spartacus. If you've seen the masterpiece military clip of General Serena on television, you'll see that this same Crassus, who became arrogant after his victories in Europe, decided to head east to the region ruled by the Parthians. General Serena gives him a great lesson. It's interesting to note that most of the slaves who worked in Rome were brought from North Africa. This story begins after the defeat of Carthage because the Carthaginian Empire, which was based in North Africa, was Rome's greatest enemy. Therefore, when Carthage was defeated, the Romans enslaved most of its inhabitants, especially the men. The women were not strong enough for hard labor and were made lighter slaves. They mainly sought slaves who were strong and young, though women who were beautiful were selected for harems and sexual slavery. They even ran brothels with women slaves from other countries. These were the same Romans who had been fighting Iran for 700 years, both during the Parthian and Sasanian eras. Despite this, neither in the Parthian nor in the Sasanian government was slavery common in this way. When they captured enemy soldiers, they would enslave them, and most of these were Romans. However, some kings had their own laws. There were kings in these two dynasties who said that non-Zoroastrians should be enslaved. Interestingly, if someone converted to Zoroastrianism, they would no longer be enslaved. They would be set free and told, "You are free now, go." Many philosophers in ancient Rome protested against the condition of these slaves, but such protests often led to their own deaths. They would say, "You want to incite a rebellion? You shouldn't make the slaves believe that even if the Roman Empire collapses, slavery will not end." You may not believe it, but slavery still exists today. It's true that these modern slaves work in exchange for money, but their condition is no better than the slaves of ancient times. Please support us with subscribe, like, and comments, and thanks for your watching.